rockers love to show off. Flamboyance is in our blood. But the idea of the crowd-pleasing frontman is older than you might think. Starting way before I played in 70s supergroups, even before Elvis first swiveled a hip. That's because I believe the founding father of modern rock lived nearly 300 years ago. And there's a very good chance that you've got his most famous album in your pocket. Oh, excuse me. Hello? That music is the Four Seasons, and the genius who wrote it was Antonio Vivaldi. Composer of a masterpiece truly avant-garde in its day, one that is still the most recorded classical work ever.
You can feel the power of certain compositions. This one is phenomenally powerful.
He was also a violinist of such exceptional talent that he became the biggest star Europe had known.
I think of him like Hendrix, you know, visionary and a great instrumentalist.
I'd have him in the band.
Yeah, well, he's in our band first. I booked him first.
So why, after becoming such a phenomenon, did Vivaldi and his music virtually disappear for almost 200 years after he died? The answers lie at the heart of one of Europe's great musical cities. Here, I'll turn detective to discover how this 18th century priest became the trailblazing god of rock, writer of the ultimate concept album.
God, I've never even seen some of these instruments before.
I'm travelling back in time to discover the truth behind Vivaldi and the mystery of the Four Seasons. You may not know this about me, but before I was a grumpy old man, before, yes, huge stadium tours and multi-platinum selling solo albums, I was just a long-haired teenager studying here at the Royal College of Music in London. Back then, I was never allowed to play on this stage. That was just a dream. Like my hope that one day, before I ran away to become a rocker, that is, I would write music that would become timeless, classic. And I'd play it in a way that had fans on their feet, clamouring for more. Basically, I wanted to follow in Vivaldi's footsteps. I'd like to read you a quote. It was written in 1715 by Zacharias von Offenbach, a German traveller and scholar who had just been to see a concert in one of the many theatres in Venice. He wrote, "Towards the end, Vivaldi played a solo accompaniment admirably, adding at the end a free fantasy which quite frightened me, for it is scarcely possible that anyone ever played or will play it in this way, for he placed his fingers but a hair's breadth from the bridge, so that there was barely room for the bow, doing all this on 4 strings with imitations and incredible speed." Offenbach had just seen the first ever rock star, doing what few other musicians would do for many hundreds of years to come. He just witnessed and heard the incredible genius of Antonio Vivaldi, writer of the great Baroque classic, The Four Seasons. Written in 1723, it's still the most recorded classical piece of all time. One that is now so impossible to escape that it's become loved and loathed in equal measure. But to dismiss it is to ignore just how revolutionary this masterpiece is, because it helped to define the modern concerto and was at the forefront of a truly radical idea that music could tell the listener a story without the use of words. But don't just take it from me. I'm off to ask someone who plays it, one of our most gifted and in-demand young violinists, the Scottish virtuoso Nicola Benedetti.
I I think they're one of the greatest works of art of our entire body of classical music. I mean, I don't even have any time for cynicism towards these four concertos. The core subject of every single movement is something that is so definitive, so strong, so lovable.
What I think is a work of art with it is the fact that there's a severe degree of difficulty in the playing. But to a listener, it doesn't sound like that all the time.
It's extremely challenging for an audience. A violinist wants to be challenged. We want to be able to play something that's hard and that you can really get your teeth stuck into. But an audience also wants to see you go through that. They want to see you tackle these things, overcome them, and like get to the end of something impossible. And at the end of the summer concerto, everyone's always like, "Oh, wow."
He was an amazing player himself.
Yes.
You know, a phenomenal player.
You had to be to write this
Well,
stuff.
exactly. I mean, I've always considered it a wonderful showing-off piece.
Oh, it is. I mean, there's absolutely no question about that. In the summer concerto, which is this place is the first kind of really consistent, fast, especially with the right hand, fast playing that you hear. So you're playing this suddenly very sort of fiery, virtuosic playing. And throughout the summer concerto, I mean, the whole thing is like, by the end of it,
It's flat out.
your arms. I always, before the autumn concerto, I'm always just like somehow trying to create an excuse to give myself just 5 minutes to let my right arm just calm down.
There's no turning back. There's no respite of any little stepping stone to rest on for a couple of minutes.
Exactly.
Which must be pretty exciting for audiences.
Oh, I'm sure. And Vivaldi being the wild personality that he was, I'm sure reacted to that hugely and played up to it and tried to manipulate it and saw it as a challenge. Just think of the mastery of this, and just the level of complications in being able to write something like this is just phenomenal. I mean, he really became a household name, and I can only imagine what the impact it had on the people that were there and then.
All of this begs the question. If Vivaldi was the superstar of his day, an adored genius who wrote the 18th century's biggest hit, why did he and his masterwork largely disappear after he died? To solve these mysteries, I have to travel back to where it all began, to a city that was once one of the most debauched on the planet. Well, where else would you expect to find a rock god? Venice is one of the most beautiful and bizarre cities in the world. Built completely on stilts in the middle of a lagoon and sinking, slowly but surely, year after year. It's been a tourist mecca for centuries. But though you can take home anything from a carnival mast to a miniature gondola, the one thing you can't buy is an image of Venice's most famous sun.
So much of Vivaldi's story is still shrouded in myth and legend, and what little we do know is still the subject of much conjecture and debate. In fact, the experts can't even seem to agree on what he looked like.
We do know he had flaming red hair, earning him the nickname Il Prete Rosso, the Red Priest. But the best known and most reproduced image of him is dismissed by most experts as probably not him at all. We know this engraving is him. It was supposedly made for an early published version of the Four Seasons. But the best likeness is this one, done by a caricature artist.
You like it? Yeah, it's really clever.
Then again, they can make you look like anyone, can't they?
Wow,
What we definitely do know about Antonio Lucia Vivaldi is that he was born on March the 4th, 1678, here in Braga, in an unknown house somewhere on this square. Legend has it that his birth coincided with an earthquake, although no record of one has actually ever been found. Born prematurely, allegedly just 7 months after his parents' marriage, he was immediately baptised by a midwife for fear he might die.
We know this thanks to a rare and important document discovered just 50-odd years ago in the nearby church. The current parish priest, Don Giovanni, has agreed to show it to me.
Questo è il registro dei battesimi 1664-1691, quindi comprende esattamente il periodo in cui sono vissuti Antonio Vivaldi e i suoi fratelli. È scritto che ricevette l'acqua dalla comare, cioè la levatrice ha avuto queste difficoltà respiratorie, è stato in pericolo di vita probabilmente, assalito da questi attacchi di asma che ha conservato per tutta la vita. Poi il sacerdote completa facendo i riti cosiddetti suppletori.
I just think how wonderful it is that things survive centuries and centuries. And at the time, the person who wrote that in that book would have absolutely no idea what an important document that would turn out to be, you know, so many hundreds of years later. That is really quite special. I just think it's fantastic. I love looking at things like that. That is just amazing. I have to ask you, do you like Vivaldi's music?
Ah, noi ascoltiamo sempre tutti i giorni. Qua viviamo di pane e Vivaldi. Pane e musica di Vivaldi.
There's no official monument to Vivaldi anywhere in Venice, but here, in this little church, I stumbled across one admirer who has created her own special tribute.
Allora c'è una signora francese che viene da Tolosa che, come dire, ha preso a cuore il battistero e lei porta sempre i fiori, mi trasforma la chiesa in un negozio di fiori. Passione, passione. A volte deve fare i conti con me perché io la frena un pochino. E cede un pochino nel fervore.
Brigitte Tillack fell in love with Vivaldi during a holiday in Venice. She moved here 9 years ago and now makes a daily pilgrimage to worship at her shrine.
So what was it you loved about Vivaldi?
Il a fait pour moi la plus belle musique qui soit. Et je voudrais dire aussi que je vois beaucoup de gens ici qui viennent exprès pour ce grand compositeur, que ce soit des musiciens ou des journalistes. Et je parle beaucoup avec ces gens-là. Et un jour, une personne à qui je disais vraiment Antonio Vivaldi est le plus grand des compositeurs, lui m'a répondu non seulement le plus grand, mais Antonio Vivaldi est la musica.
The flowers came first. You brought the flowers first.
Yes.
And then the bust you had, yeah?
Et après, j'ai fait en 2012, et le sculpteur a travaillé sur ces deux portraits.
Oh, from the caricature, yeah. I think it's lovely that you do. I mean, it's fantastic. It's important. Music, composers and music need people like you. You must be a very wealthy lady to be able to bring all these flowers and do the bust.
Alors, c'est tout le contraire.
Oh, wow.
C'est tout le contraire. Je vis très modestement, vraiment très, très modestement. Et j'aime cette vie, justement. Et j'adore, comment dire, lui rendre hommage en ayant cette vie que j'ai choisie, cette vie très modeste.
Well, I hope the florist give you a very good deal. to her, and in fact to a lot of people, he's still alive. If somebody's music still lives, then to some extent they're still living as well. And the mere fact that she cares that much to do it, that pleases many thousands of people who come to see the church as well, I think it's pretty amazing. Can't imagine anybody doing that for me.
The church would turn out to play a vital role in the making of Antonio Vivaldi, but it was his father who first nurtured his talent. A barber turned violinist in the orchestra of St. Mark's Cathedral, he eventually gave it up to manage his son, who, by his teens, was already a master of both the violin and the harpsichord. But in the 18th century, musicians were just jobbing tradesmen, not high-earning celebrities. So, at 15, young Antonio joined the priesthood. After a decade's training, he was ordained in 1703, but within a year asked to be excused from saying Mass, blaming the illness which had dogged him from birth. Far from being reprimanded, he was allowed to continue as a priest. Vivaldi was lucky to live at a time and in a place where the church was willing to indulge his true calling.
When Vivaldi lived and worked in Venice, it truly was the musical centre of Europe. In the 18th century, it was awash with the stuff. Nietzsche, the philosopher, was once known to have commented, "When I search for a word to replace that of music, I can think only of Venice."
Back then, gondoliers sang as they cruised the canals. There was daily singing in churches, and music was celebrated in concerts, both public and private. The musical fashion was for experimentation, creating a need for completely new instruments.
God, I've never even seen some of these instruments before. This is my sweet shop. This is, oh wow, look at that. I mean, that's a work of art as well, look at that. I want one. I mean, this is an education. They say that music is the world's longest apprenticeship course. Boy, is that true. At 65, I'm still learning.
Whilst still a priest, Vivaldi was now free to pursue his musical dream as both ambitious composer and star violinist. His playing was so exceptional that one guidebook of the time even listed him as the must-see attraction in Venice. And it wasn't long before this extraordinary talent brought him a new job offer, one that would change his life and music forever. To find out more, I've come to meet another woman who fell in love with Vivaldi.
Attracted you to the Venice Park, assuming you were living...
For almost 20 years, Mickey White worked as a Wimbledon photographer. Now she lives in Venice, investigating Vivaldi's association with a truly amazing institution.
When he was 25, just after he'd been ordained, he went to the Pieta to be the violin teacher.
So what exactly was the Pieta?
The Pieta was an institution for abandoned children. The majority of children that were left were due to prostitution.
So before the Ospedales and the Pieta, what would have happened to these children?
Chucked in the canal.
Oh, you're joking.
No. You see, the Pieta was founded by a Franciscan who was so appalled at seeing babies floating in the canal that he founded a home for abandoned children. It was one of the 4 institutions set up by the state, and all these ospedali did music. They all had their own musicians. But the interesting thing was that it was only the women that did music, the men did not do music. They would perform primarily for the church. Then they would do concerts in the music room for visiting nobles from Italy and Europe.
So we know that some of these girls were very fine players. How good actually were they?
I think they were exceptional. And in fact, the Pieta got a reputation for being the best ospedale for music in Venice.
But those who came expecting to be close up and personal with a bevy of beautiful players were often disappointed. The audience were only ever treated to a tantalising glimpse of these young virtuosos. That's because when they performed, they were hidden behind grilles very similar to the ones here. It's also likely that they would be very modestly dressed, probably in black and white with veils covering their hair. What a tease.
In fact, far from being the nubile young group of folklore, the women of the orchestra ranged in age from 11 to 75, many staying on to play music at the Pieta their entire lives.
The space they played in wasn't huge. Just imagine 30 to 40 of those women, players and singers, all crammed onto a balcony, often smaller than this, and playing alongside them their fiery red-haired maestro, pushing his violin to the limit and encouraging them to improvise and play free-form solos, just like he did.
He was an unusual person. I think the first thing that would come into mind would be wild guy. He knew how to entertain. One visitor went to this concert, which was in a church, and Don Antonio Vivaldi, a famous composer and player, was prevailed upon to play during Vespers in the above-mentioned church, which was so packed with people that scuffles broke out. In fact, it says, la gente sono svenuti. They fainted. They fainted.
How would you compare that with things that have happened sort of in the 20th and 21st century with sort of popular music and rock bands?
It's the same. It's the same.
See, I think he started it.
Absolutely. Vivaldi mania.
Vivaldi mania, I like that.
Vivaldi's talent and flair would bring him enormous fame and success, but his rebellious streak would also attract enemies and sow the seeds of his eventual destruction. By the early 1700s, Vivaldi was filling Venice with exciting new music, creating not just instrumental pieces, but dozens of operas, oratorios, and sacred works too. He was writing 2 concertos a month for his all-girl band and beginning to find his true calling as a composer. Having a private orchestra with which to experiment enabled him to develop a unique and challenging style, one that would go on to change the face of music.
Isn't it lovely how sort of great composers of the day like Vivaldi helped young musicians come through? For example, 9 p.m. tonight, Vivaldi, The Four Seasons, and his support act, W.A. Mozart. Doesn't get any better than that, does it?
Vivaldi's revolutionary vision was that the music itself should tell a story. The players would paint pictures with their instruments and the listeners could follow them like a plot. This reached its peak with a masterwork, written when he was 45 and at the height of his creative powers. It features 12 concertos he grandly named the contest between harmony and invention. 4 of them tower above the others. We know them, of course, as the 4 Seasons.
Hello, lovely to see you. Great.
Come along.
Okay.
To find out more about what inspired the most famous of his 500 or so concertos, I've come to the Venice Conservatoire to meet musician and Vivaldi scholar Susan Orlando.
I will then use that.
I mean, he lived in the city here in Venice. What would he know about the countryside and the seasons?
What is certain is that he went and worked in the court in Mantova a few years before The Four Seasons was published. And if you think about him coming from Venice, where there are very few trees, if any, there's no grass, you don't hear the lovely twitter of birds in Venice very much. And so, you know, there might be an argument that The Four Seasons was an inspiration that came to him when he spent this time in Mantova.
It's something that the listener can immediately latch onto. It's something that they can work with to form their own pictures.
I think it's part of the secret of Vivaldi and why his music works so well, is that somehow Vivaldi knew how, he had the keys to writing a kind of music that speaks immediately to the listener. It touches your emotion immediately, and you can then listen to it millions of times, and you never get tired of it. I've often told this story twice. I've had people in my house, once I think was an electrician, and another time a plumber or something, where they were working away, and in the background I had Vivaldi's music was playing, and 2 separate times these people came to me and said, "Lady, I don't listen to classical music, but this stuff is great."
I'd like to think that he knew how good he was.
Oh, I'm sure he knew how good he was. I have no doubt that he knew exactly how good he was. As you said to me earlier, in a way, Vivaldi was a kind of a rock star because he played in such an exceptional way, very extravagant, you know, and he would have been conducting from his violin as well. So, you know, he could really show off, move around, and he could improvise all his cadences. And this meant that people started talking about him and created a star.
But for someone as famous as Vivaldi, 18th century Venice wasn't always an easy or safe place to be. The city was a hotbed of intrigue and innuendo, and her citizens were well aware that the state kept its eye on them. Along every canal, around every corner, loitered an army of spies and informants eager to report any salacious tidbit, especially about celebrities.
In a strange way, I know what it feels like to be spied on. It's not very nice. You know, sometimes it's your fault. I was spied on between marriages by the press and the media, which is, I suppose, is fine. It's their job. That's what they do. But it is a very, very weird feeling to know that even if you're innocent on something, every corner you go around, there's likely to be somebody there about to pounce out and either ask you a question or accuse you of something. But back then, it must have been really horrendous because it was the authorities that did the spying. And pretty nasty if you got caught.
The cause of Vivaldi's problems was, inevitably for a rock star, the whiff of a sex scandal.
Some rumour mongers now began questioning how the Red Priest could possibly resist his talented young charges. When he was 58, during a trip to Mantua, Vivaldi met a talented young singer named Anna Gira, some 40-odd years his junior. She quickly became something of a muse, a travelling companion, and if the gossip is to be believed, a hell of a lot more.
Vivaldi adamantly denied wrongdoing, claiming Anna was merely his prodigy and a help to a sick man. But I'm off to meet someone who presents an altogether different picture. For 60 years, Dr. Virgilio Baccardi has lived on the very square where Vivaldi was born. An award-winning journalist, writer and filmmaker, he wrote a book outlining his investigation into the Red Priest.
un bel momento c'era un rapporto senz'altro un rapporto non da prete ma da uomo con Anna Giraud, ecco, questa è la mia opinione. Ma è un rapporto quello difficile da chiarire, perché lui era un prete, ma io sostengo che pur essendo un prete, sotto il vestito da prete c'era un uomo. Quindi lui dice che c'era un rapporto soltanto professionale con Anna Giraud, ma io penso invece che ci fosse qualche cosa di più. C'è la testimonianza di Goldoni che è stato il grande commediografo veneziano del Settecento, e Vivaldi azzardò una prima domanda a Goldoni: che le pare di Anna Giraud? E Goldoni rispose: boh, come cantante non vale molto, è piuttosto una grande attrice più che cantante. Allora Vivaldi naturalmente si arrabbiò in base a questa risposta, e allora in quel momento cosa fa? Chiama Anna Giraud, che appare dalla camera da letto di Vivaldi.
So was he a happy man in himself, do you think?
Ma secondo me non era un personaggio simpatico, per varie ragioni. Per esempio lui teneva molto al denaro, ci sono delle lettere in cui lui reclama, protesta perché non è stato pagato, ma sono cifre piccolissime, quindi protestare per così poco vuol dire che lui era un po' avaro.
And as through much of his life, money would soon become a serious problem. Vivaldi had enjoyed almost 40 years on and off at the Pieta while travelling around Europe. But by the mid-1730s, his bosses had tired of his frequent absences, and seeing the decline of their once great orchestra, they cut the Red Priests loose for good. Suddenly, the star once feted by cardinals and kings was in dire financial straits.
Nobody really knows why for sure, but in 1740 it seems that Vivaldi decided to start afresh. He left this house on the Grand Canal, his last known residence in Venice, to travel to Vienna, possibly in search of a new patron. But once there, the prince that he had pinned some of his hopes on died, and work never materialised.
A year later, he was dead, aged 63, of an unknown illness recorded simply as an internal inflammation. With little more ceremony than a peal of bells, he was buried in obscurity in Vienna's hospital cemetery. Almost immediately, Vivaldi and his work disappeared. His revolutionary music was out of fashion, overshadowed by a trend for a new and much simpler style. I can sympathise. It must have been the 18th century equivalent of punk sweeping away prog rock. But it was worse for Vivaldi. There was no recording industry to keep his music alive, and often there would be only one handwritten copy of a piece of music. Which perhaps explains why there's no complete original manuscript of the Four Seasons in existence. There is one copy in the world, but it isn't, as you might expect, in Italy. In fact, it's right under our noses, here in the UK. Hidden deep in the vaults of Manchester Central Library. Ros Edwards, the curator of the music collection, has agreed to show me.
Ooh. Gosh, this is absolutely brilliant. So how much of the Four Seasons have you got?
We've got all four parts of all four of the concertos.
Have you really?
Yes. And that spring, it's been beautifully copied out, that one.
It has, isn't it?
Yeah. It would have been written by a copyist. Because it's so neat and tidy, we think it was written for a special commission.
I mean, how would this compare to what we know as the Four Seasons today?
It's similar in most cases, but there are one or two passages that are different.
What really makes these concertos unique is that each season features a set of instructions in the form of sonnets, likely to have been written by Vivaldi himself.
The sonnets were sort of indicating what the music was about for both the player and the audience.
So in their mind, the listener would know
because they could follow the music through by the poem. Some of what he wrote were very specific to the text of the music. So he'll have written dogs are barking, thunder and lightning, but he also wrote sort of lines that indicated some sort of mood, like soporific sort of summer heat.
It really was a concept album.
Yes.
Well, without the recording.
Yes.
Never been done before.
No, not to my knowledge.
It just shows what's possibly still out there, doesn't it?
Yes.
I'm going to go to every car boot sale this year.
You never know.
And buy every piece of music I can find. This is astonishing.
Seeing these books is a revelation because they've confirmed for me something I've long suspected. The Four Seasons isn't just a work of genius, it's also a blueprint for the kind of music I write.
Seeing this evokes so many things. I mean, first of all, the fact that it's 300 years old. I've always said there's a great connection between the Baroque period and, shall we say, the 70s in particular, the late 60s and the 70s in modern day rock music or popular music, because it has that same formula. It's complicated but sounds simple, and there's an art to playing it. And I can't help but think the guy who maybe did these pages in D sort of written them out and gone home, to his missus. What did you do today, dear? Oh, I had copies of Vivaldi parts. And he goes, that looks all right, he's playing it next Sunday. How wonderful is that?
I'm now more convinced than ever that The Four Seasons really was the first concept album. But what do my fellow rockers think? I've come to test my theory on a pioneer of the form, one of the founders of prog superband Genesis, the guitarist Mike Rutherford.
What would you consider the definition of a concept album really to be?
I suppose an album with the musical freedom that's required and a story, really. It has to have a start, a middle, a finish, an end, and a purpose.
And the purpose and the story would be to help the musician or to help the listener, or both?
Kind of both, right? Almost more to make the body of work get across to the audience. You know, you need the words to tell the story, you need the music to follow the words. It's a kind of great platform to work from because you're free, really, in between. I mean, that's how I felt it with us. You know, in my case, Genesis, it was just a kind of freedom. It was just like a chance to write whatever the hell you wanted. It's a way to present drama, you know, because songs, pop songs and hit songs are a certain sort of thing, but the longer pieces you can, as you did yourself, you can create a drama and a mood and atmosphere.
If you made a list of the great concept albums, would you say that The Four Seasons would actually slot in and go, yeah, that comes under that category?
Yeah, 100%. It's a fabulous concept idea. It's so simple, isn't it?
It's a simple idea, something that people can recognise. Yeah. Great tunes.
Yeah. You should be able to just sort of say one sentence and everyone gets what it's all about, which obviously in this case the title tells you in a way, really. You're suddenly in, aren't you? You get drawn in. And before you even hear the music, you're imagining certain things straight away, visually.
Would you like to think that maybe in 200 years' time that the concepts that you put together with Genesis, would you like to think that they could happily sit alongside stuff like Vivaldi's Four Seasons?
Good question. I mean, that'd be a wonderful thought. I think he'd be an interesting character.
I'd have him in the band.
Yeah, well, he's in our band first. I booked him first. So.
But still, there are questions to be answered. How did this prototype rock finally dig its way out of obscurity? And once rediscovered, what was it about the Four Seasons that made it the classic we now all know and love? It might be impossible to believe now, but until the late 1920s, Antonio Vivaldi was virtually unheard of, known really only for the influence he had on other composers, like Bach. What really put him and the Four Seasons back on the musical map was the birth of the recording industry.
The arrival of the LP in the 1940s meant that millions of people everywhere around the world could hear this exciting new music for the very first time. This was largely thanks not to a European, but to an American violinist and concertmaster, more known for his work in Hollywood.
Louis Kaufman played solo violin on close to 500 iconic movie soundtracks, including Gone with the Wind. His 1947 album of the Four Seasons kick-started the modern Vivaldi revival, spawning over 1,000 different recordings. But it was Nigel Kennedy's version in 1989 that propelled Vivaldi into the charts, thanks to the full pop marketing treatment.
The Mail on Sunday presents one of the biggest selling classical albums of all time, Vivaldi's Four Seasons.
With anything this popular comes the inevitable backlash, and that's left lovers of the Four Seasons searching for ways to put a new spin on it. I'm off to meet one of them. Max Richter is a genre-hopping British composer who has given the Seasons a 21st century makeover, complete with its own app.
I had this weird sort of experience of like falling in love with this music when I was a kid. And then as I sort of got older, I just became aware of like hearing it all the time, but like on the telly, on jingles and adverts, in the shopping centre. I started to kind of hate it. So really I just sort of set out on this journey to try and sort of rediscover the original, and just starting to kind of try to kind of encounter it afresh.
So what is it you've actually done with the Four Seasons then?
In a way it's like a remix, but it's not a remix made in the computer or in the studio. It's a remix of the actual dots on the page, done, you know, with a pencil. It's almost like a co-write, you know, it's a collaborative project, except I've only got the score. I haven't got him on the phone or sitting in the studio. One of the things that sort of drew me to the Vivaldi was the fact that I felt like there was a natural overlap between what I naturally do and Vivaldi's music, because actually, in a way, Vivaldi's music is very modern. It looks very contemporary on the page, weirdly enough. His music is really modular, it's really chunky. It's sort of pattern music. You know, those of us who like work with computers and stuff and recording are very familiar with this idea of, you know, that way of structuring music. I mean, dance music's all made like that, you know, electronic music mostly. So I felt like there was a kind of a sympathy there anyway.
So if he were alive today, what do you think he would say?
You know, the first person to rework the Four Seasons was him. You know, I mean, he repurposed it and mashed it up for all sorts of other things. And composers have always done that.
Yeah.
It's part of what composers do.
Yeah.
So I don't think he would have a problem with it, actually. I think he would be, like, really fine.
In fact, I think Vivaldi would positively love it that almost 300 years after his death, his music lives on. Not just in its more traditional form, but in ways he could surely never have imagined. Back on the outskirts of Venice, I've come to meet Croatian musician Mysteria, founder of a global gathering of players and arrangers who go by the name of the Vivaldi Metal Project.
What sort of gave you the idea that you could actually do a metal version of the music?
I think Vivaldi wrote the most of his music in the Four Seasons with the same approach as today metal music. He was a real rock star, and not just because he was known, but because his music was really rock. I mean, in the way he keeps rhythm going. He was always searching for the best melodies and understandable harmonies.
Yeah. I agree. I think that his audience would be very new. For the first time, you would have audiences sitting, going,
yeah, that's the way.
For the first time, which is not dissimilar to as we have with metal. It's exaggerated the same way. I'm guessing you haven't taken Vivaldi's music note for note.
My idea was not to do exactly note by notes, but I want to keep the energy of the Vivaldi music. What we are trying to avoid, of course, violins doing what is in the original, because I could not for sure do better than Vivaldi did. So it's useless. I started to work on the summer, and especially third movement. I started with drums and some guitar that I named Inferno. So.
Okay. Tony Iommi would be proud of you. Okay.
I hope so. I want to give also some epicness, so I added some choir.
That's great. It really is good. I'm more and more convinced, the more I'm on this journey of Vivaldi and the Four Seasons, that this is the route that he would have taken.
So
I'm now even more convinced.
So he was a metal guy.
Maybe yes, in his own way he was. Maybe in his own way he was.
More than anything, what I've come to realise is that just like the music I write, the Four Seasons was all about making people feel good. And Vivaldi was the first great frontman, an 18th century rock god. In fact, the more I've learnt about the Red Priest, the more I know I owe him a huge debt of musical gratitude.
And so I'm going to show my appreciation in the best way I know how, by performing, ladies and gentlemen, a prog rock version of the main themes from Vivaldi's Four Seasons. Sorry, Antonio.